Welcome back. Let yourself grow still and let the day quietly slip away. Bit by bit, we'll drift back into the old Egyptian story of two brothers and a broken bond. Should this help you fall asleep, subscribe and I'll have another for you tomorrow. Nut's body arches across the world. In the oldest Egyptian depictions of her, she is a woman whose form is the sky itself. Her back curved in a long, smooth arc above the earth, her fingers touching the western horizon, her toes resting against the eastern one, her blue skin painted with the stars that ancient Egyptians named and tracked and built their calendars around. The world of gods and of human beings exists in the space between her body and the body of Geb below, Geb who is the earth, who lies stretched out beneath her, the ground itself, his long form, the reason the land has the shape it does. In this space between them, everything that would come to matter had not yet begun. The four children who would divide the divine family across every telling of the story for thousands of years had not yet arrived. The air between Nut and Geb was still. The family at the center of this story was called the Ennead of Heliopolis, and the word Ennead simply means nine. 9 gods whose relationships formed a kind of diagram, a structure that made the universe narratively intelligible to the ancient Egyptians who lived inside it, offering them a theology that was also a family that was also a map of every force that governed their world. At the beginning of that diagram stood Atum, the self-created god, who came into being in the primordial water before anything else existed. From Atum came Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, the first division of the world into complementary forces. From Shu and Tefnut came Gub and Nut, earth and sky, and from Gub and Nut, when the time came and the circumstances arrived that would make it possible, came 4 children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, 9 gods, a diagram, a world made sensible through the grammar of a family. Gub and Nut were themselves the children of a transgression. Shu, their father, had at some point separated them, had physically placed himself between them, a god holding the sky away from the earth with his arms raised, his posture fixed in the particular effort of a figure who has been holding something apart for a very long time. The images of Shu, performing this function, appear across Egyptian temple walls and papyri with a consistency that suggests the Egyptians found something important in that posture, something true about the relationship between air and earth, and the effort required to maintain the space between them. To separated his children to prevent them from coupling. The separation was a prohibition, a boundary held in place by the god of air's own extended arms. Geb and Nut coupled anyway. This is the weight the 4 siblings were born carrying, not a weight that any ancient Egyptian source describes in terms of guilt or consequence for the children themselves, but a structural weight, a narrative one. The first family of gods had already established that the rules of the cosmic order could be moved against, that the prohibitions of even a divine father could be circumvented, that something transgressive was already embedded in the lineage from which Osiris and Set and Isis and Nephthys would descend. The world they were born into was one in which a boundary had already been crossed before they arrived to cross any themselves. This is simply the shape of the family as the oldest sources hold it, and it is worth noticing quietly, the way one notices a small mark on an old object, not alarmed by it, only attentive. The births of the 4 siblings, the Egyptian sources preserve this, were separated in time by the decrees of Ra himself, who had placed a prohibition on Nut's ability to bear children in any month of the existing calendar. What Thoth did in response, in the version of the story that the sources hold, involves the invention of the 5 epagamenal days, the days outside the calendar, the overflow that brought the year to 365, days on which Ra's prohibition did not apply. This is the kind of mythological detail that reveals how the Egyptians organized time itself around the needs of their divine family. The calendar had to be broken open to make room for these 4 particular births. Each sibling was born on one of these extra days. Each entered the world through a gap that had been made for them in the structure of time itself. Set's birth was different from the others. In the version preserved in the oldest sources, Set did not wait. He tore himself from Nut's womb prematurely, bursting through her side rather than arriving in the ordered way his siblings arrived. Impatient in a way that the myth registers without elaborating on, simply marking the fact that his entry into the world was unlike theirs. His birth was a kind of rupture, not a violent one in any dramatic sense. The ancient texts seem to emphasize as wrongdoing. Set was not condemned for it, and the sources do not treat it as a transgression against Nut, so much as a characteristic, a first notation about the nature of the god who was arriving. He came before he was called. He came through the side of things rather than through the appointed opening. This detail, the premature, sideways, self-determined birth, appears across several ancient accounts of Set's character, as if it were the first sentence of a longer description, a detail the tradition kept returning to because it was felt to illuminate something essential. Set is a figure who does not wait. Set is a figure for whom the given structure of things is not sufficient containment. He arrived in the world by breaking through a wall that was not meant to be broken, not because he was malicious, not because the sources say he wished his mother harm, but because something in his nature moved before the moment was ready for him. This is simply one of the things the myth notices about Set, and it is the first thing it notices, and it is the thing it noticed before he had done anything at all. The world into which the 4 siblings were born was already arranged. Nut arched above. Geb lay below. Shu stood between his children with his arms raised. The Nile ran through the valley between the desert and the fields, and the fields were dark with the silt that the river left behind. Each year when the flood receded, and the desert was pale and wide beyond them, and the sun crossed the sky in its arc from east to west, from Nut's toes to Nut's fingertips, the daily journey that the Egyptians understood as Ra's passage through the 12 hours of the day, and then back again through the 12 hours of the night below the world. Order was the given condition of things. Ma'at, the principle of cosmic truth and right arrangement, was not something the Egyptians believed had to be invented. It was what the world was when it was working correctly. The gods and the pharaoh and the rituals performed in the temples were all part of the effort to maintain what was already there. Into this arranged world came 4 siblings who would become the primary actors in the most important mythological narrative ancient Egypt produced. The story of what happened among them was not a story the Egyptians invented as a speculation. It was a story they held to be embedded in the nature of things, a structure as fixed as the division of the world into the fertile black land of the Nile Valley and the dry red land of the desert, as fixed as the daily passage of the sun from one horizon to the other. The characters of the myth were interchangeable with the forces they represented. Scholars who have studied the Egyptian mythological tradition have noted this with some precision. The positions in the family are more stable than the figures who occupy them. The king, the usurper, the widow, the avenger, these roles are constant across every telling. The gods step into them the way the sun steps into its arc each morning, the way the flood arrives each year to darken the fields. Jan Assmann, one of the scholars who has given close attention to Egyptian theological structures, observed that the family of Osiris functions as a kind of narrative machine, a system for generating meaning through the interaction of fixed positions. The eldest son who rules, the brother who disrupts, the wife who restores, the child who avenges. Each position implies the others. The machine runs because each figure is what it is in relation to the others. King because the other is usurper, widow because the other is murderer. What makes this observation useful, and what the ancient sources bear out across thousands of years of attestation, is the sense that the Egyptians were not watching a story happen, so much as they were watching a structure operate. The myth was not surprising to them. It was explanatory. It told them why the world was the shape it was, why the flood returned each year, why the pharaoh was always the son of the god who had died and been restored, why the dead could be judged and welcomed into a life beyond the one they had known. The murder at the center of the story was not an accident. It was the hinge on which everything else turned. The ancient sources that preserve this family's story are very old. The oldest written evidence comes from the burial chamber of the pharaoh Unas at Saqqara, a small, low-ceilinged room cut into the limestone of the pyramid there, its walls covered floor to ceiling in vertical columns of hieroglyphs. The pyramid texts of Unas, inscribed circa 2375 BCE, are the oldest religious texts in Egypt, and possibly among the oldest anywhere. Their hieroglyphs were cut deep into the pale limestone and then filled with blue pigment, the blue of the sky, the blue of Nut's painted body, so that the spells covering every surface of that underground room glow in a particular color when lit. These texts presuppose the story of the divine family. They do not explain it. They reference Osiris, Set, the conflict between them, the role of Isis, the resurrection. They use these figures the way any later tradition uses figures its audience already knows. The implication is clear, and it has not been lost on Egyptologists. The story was old when it was first written down. By the time the workers at Saqqara were cutting those columns of hieroglyphs into the limestone of Unas's burial chamber, the myth of Osiris and Set was already so well established that it required no introduction, no summary, no explanation. It was simply the story everyone knew. This is one of the particular qualities of Egyptian mythology that rewards attention, the depth of its antiquity. The four figures who would become the center of the Assyrian narrative cycle were being venerated in forms that preceded writing itself. Osiris's cult at Abydos, Set's at Ombos. These were ancient centers of devotion whose origins lie in the pre-dynastic period, in settlement layers that archaeologists have excavated, but that the Egyptians themselves no longer remembered as having any beginning. By the time the pyramid texts were carved, the story was already old. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, when the coffin texts carried the tradition forward into a new form and a wider social context, the story was ancient. By the time of the New Kingdom, when the Book of the Dead brought it to a still broader audience, it was immemorial. No one living in any period of Egyptian history had ever known the world without this story in it. The four siblings appear together in Egyptian relief carvings and paintings in the characteristic forms by which the tradition identified them across thousands of years. Osiris is wrapped in white linen from his shoulders to his feet, the way the dead are wrapped, his hands holding the crook and the flail crossed against his chest, the Atef crown rising above his head, a tall white crown flanked by ostrich feathers, its height making him the tallest figure in whatever scene he occupies. His skin is painted green in the associations his cult carried with vegetation and renewal, or sometimes black with the associations of fertile soil and the dead. He is always still. He is always contained. His posture is the posture of a figure who has been somewhere else and returned. Isis stands beside him with the hieroglyph of her name balanced perfectly on her head, a throne sign, flat-based and clean-angled, her crown a notation of her identity as clearly as a name spoken aloud. She is often shown with wings spread in a protective arc, her face turned outward, the attitude of absolute competence in the protection of what she tends. Nephthys appears in funerary reliefs and papyri with her own hieroglyph above her head, a basket balanced on a house, the sign that gives her name in the Egyptian script, a symbol that translates roughly as mistress of the house or lady of the enclosure. In funerary papyri, appears most often at the feet of Osiris's wrapped and mummified body, her arms raised in the gesture of lamentation, hands open, forearms lifted, the body angled forward in the posture that the ancient Egyptians understood to mean grief, the formal registration of a loss being witnessed. In these images, she is fully present at the scene of mourning. She is one of the two figures who mark the completeness of the ritual lamentation, Isis at the head, Nephthys at the feet, enclosing the mummified body between them in a frame of divine grief. Set stands among his siblings with his own identifying image, the composite creature that Egyptologists call the Shah, or the Set animal, a quadruped rendered in profile with rectangular ears that stand upright from the sides of its head, a long curved downward pointing snout, and a tail that rises and curves behind it in an angular arc. This animal appears on his head as his identifying hieroglyph in the same way that Isis's throne and Nephthys's basket appear on theirs. Among the four siblings standing in their characteristic forms, Set's identifying image is the only one that does not correspond to anything living in the natural world. Osiris and Isis are depicted in their divine human forms, their identifying objects balanced above them. Nephthys in her human form, with her hieroglyph readable and clear. Set with the head or the identifying glyph of an invented creature, something the ancient Egyptians depicted with complete confidence, cutting its image into stone walls and painting it onto papyri with the practiced ease of artisans who knew exactly what they were drawing. Even though no one from any period of Egyptian art or Egyptological scholarship has been able to determine what animal, if any, it was meant to represent. This strangeness, the unidentifiable creature worn as a divine identity, is the kind of detail the Egyptian tradition preserved without comment. The Set animal was simply what Set looked like. The ancient artisans did not seem to find it remarkable that the creature could not be matched to anything living. It was simply his. It was the thing that identified him in the divine procession, the visual notation for his name and his nature, the way his siblings could be known at a distance on a temple wall before anyone had read the hieroglyphs beside the image. Nephthys, the fourth sibling, occupies a position within the mythological structure that is worth sitting with carefully. She is assigned formally as Set's divine consort and wife. This is her structural position in the Ennead, the complement to Set the Way. Isis is the complement to Osiris, the pairing that completes the symmetry of the divine family. In the ordered arrangement of the cosmic diagram, Nephthys belongs to Set. The two couples, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys, mirror each other across the dividing line of the myth's central tension, completing the family symmetry that made the narrative diagram feel whole. The funerary texts tell a different story about her loyalties. In the pyramid texts and in the funerary papyri that carry the tradition through the Middle and New Kingdoms, Nephthys does not appear at Set's side. She appears at Osiris's bier. She appears in the company of Isis, her voice raised alongside her sisters in the formal lamentations for the dead king. She appears as a guardian and a mourner and a restorer, a figure who, when the myth reaches its most consequential moment, takes her place not beside the husband, the cosmic structure assigned to her, but beside the brother, the pattern of her presence had always seemed to prefer. The ancient sources do not explain this. They simply show it, again and again, in the consistent positioning of the figures across thousands of years of funerary imagery. Nephthys is at Osiris's feet. She is grieving. She is helping to restore what was broken. And Set, in the images at the bier of the dead god, in the mourning scenes at the heart of the funerary tradition, is not there. No image of him appears at that bedside. He is outside the frame. This is a quiet detail. The tradition does not seem to have found it especially remarkable. It was simply the truth of the thing, the way the cosmic assignments and the actual loyalties had arranged themselves. But it is the kind of detail that, once noticed, does not disappear. A wife who belongs structurally to one figure and in practice to another. A cosmic diagram in which the symmetry holds at a distance, but up close reveals that one of its pairings is more formal than actual. The four siblings stand in their ordered positions in the divine family, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys, and the arrangement looks, from a certain distance, entirely stable. From a closer distance, Nephthys is already leaning slightly toward a different gravitational center than the one the structure assigned to her. The pyramid at Saqqara, where the oldest version of this story was first committed to writing, has stood for more than 4,000 years in the Egyptian desert. The burial chamber of Unas is small. A person entering it must move slowly, aware of the low ceiling, the narrowness of the space, the close presence of all those walls dense with hieroglyphs. The columns of text covering the limestone are still legible. The blue pigment that filled the carved hieroglyphs has faded in places and remained vivid in others, so the chamber has the quality of something very old that is still somehow intact. The spells in those columns were meant to protect and guide the dead pharaoh through the underworld, but they also, in referencing Osiris and Set as figures whose story required no explanation, preserved the fact of the story's antiquity as a kind of inadvertent annotation. The myth was old when it was first written down. The chamber at Saqqara holds the oldest evidence of it, and even that evidence is already the record of something ancient. Shu is shown in the images that the Egyptians made of him in the posture that defines his function, standing between Geb and Nut with his arms raised, physically holding the sky above the earth, the god of air, in the effort of maintaining the separation that was his purpose. The images show him in what looks like a permanent posture. His arms have been raised like this for as long as the images show him. His expression in the Egyptian artistic convention, still forward-facing, composed, gives nothing away about what the effort costs. He is simply doing what he does, holding the sky above the earth, keeping the space between them open so that the world of gods and human beings can exist in that space. The tradition does not ask how long Shu can continue. It does not suggest his arms will lower, or that the sky might come down again, or that the separation he maintains is anything less than permanent and reliable. Shu holds the sky up. That is what the air does. The world exists in the space his effort creates. This is the arrangement, and it is presented as stable, as given, as the condition of the world, rather than a precarious situation requiring monitoring. And yet Geb and Nut coupled despite him. The transgression that produced the four siblings happened in the context of Shu's effort to prevent it, which means the gods who came from it entered the world already carrying the record of a prohibition that had not held, not as a punishment, not as a curse, not as anything the sources frame as a consequence the children would bear, simply as the fact of their lineage. The boundary had been crossed before they arrived. The structure had been tested before they were born, to test anything themselves. There is something in this that the Egyptians seem to have understood as simply accurate, as a correct notation about the nature of the family they were describing. Not troubling, not ominous, simply true. The four siblings were born from a union that had circumvented the cosmic order. They were born carrying that fact, the way any object carries the record of how it was made. The world continued. The sky remained above the earth. Shu held his position. The sun moved from east to west across Nut's arched body each day, and from west to east through the hours of the night below, and the Nile ran through the valley, and the fields on either side of it were dark with the silt that the flood left behind. And the desert beyond the fields was pale and wide, and the stars that the ancient Egyptians named and tracked and built their temples to align with, turned slowly above the world in the arc of Nut's painted skin. Into all of this, the four siblings arrived, one at a time, on the 5 days outside the calendar that Thoth had won from the moon to give them room to be born. Osiris first, the eldest, whose birth the older sources mark, as attended by a voice that announced the arrival of the Lord of all, Horus the elder on the 2nd day. Set on the 3rd, in the manner already noted, the rupture, the premature arrival, the god who came through the side of things before the moment was ready for him. Isis on the 4th day, Nephthys on the 5th. 5 days, 4 children from Geb and Nut, 1 child from another mother in one of the variant reckonings. The exact enumeration shifts across different periods and sources, the way the details of any very old story shift when it is carried across centuries by different hands. What does not shift? What the sources hold consistently across the pyramid texts and the coffin texts and the funerary papyri and the temple inscriptions and the accounts of Plutarch is the structure of the family itself. Osiris and Set, brothers. Isis and Nephthys, sisters. Osiris and Isis, a couple. Set and Nephthys, a couple. The eldest and the third born, the king's position and the disruptive position, paired against each other across the entire cosmological diagram of the Ennead. Their opposition, as given and as structural as the opposition of the Black Land and the Red Land, the fertile Nile Valley and the desert beyond it. The life that the annual flood made possible and the aridity that defined its edges. The 4 siblings appear together in Egyptian temple reliefs in the characteristic procession of the divine family. 4 figures standing in their proper positions, their identifying emblems balanced above their heads, their postures correct and formal and composed in the way that Egyptian divine figures are always composed, still, forward-facing, present. From a distance along a temple corridor, they look perfectly stable. The arrangement looks complete. The symmetry of the 2 couples, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys, gives the procession the quality of an orderly, balanced, well-arranged family portrait. Closer, the details begin to distinguish themselves from one another. Osiris's linen wrapping, his crook and flail, his green skin, the height of his Etef crown above his siblings' heads. Isis's throne hieroglyph, her wings, the composure in her carved or painted face that the Egyptian tradition always gave her. Nephthys's basket on a house above her brow, her posture in the funerary papyri already oriented toward a grief she will perform at someone else's bier rather than her husband, and Set standing among them, his identifying image above him, his rectangular ears, his curved tail, the long snout of the creature that is unlike anything living, the figure whose birth marked him differently from his siblings before he had done anything to earn a distinction. He is there in the procession. He is one of the four. The arrangement is symmetrical and complete and holds together in the way the Ennead's diagram was always meant to hold together. And yet Set's figure is already the one that does not quite match the others. Not threateningly, not with any quality of darkness or foreboding that the temple relief itself suggests. Simply, the other three figures can be matched in their identifying images to things a person can recognize. A wrapped body, a throne, a basket on a house. Set's image above his head belongs to a creature whose name the tradition knew and whose image the artisans cut with complete confidence, and whose face, in 4,000 years of looking, no one has ever matched to anything that has lived in the world outside the stone walls where it was first drawn. This is simply one of the things worth noticing. Quietly, as the four siblings stand in their ordered procession along the temple wall, their emblems balanced perfectly above them, the family portrait as complete and symmetrical as the cosmological diagram it was made to represent. Three of the four can be recognized at a glance. One carries the face of something that belongs entirely to the world of the myth itself, a creature that exists nowhere else, identified by every artisan who ever rendered it, and matched by none to anything outside this particular ancient, very old story. At the eastern edge of the Nile Valley, where the cultivated land comes to its end, there is a line in the earth that has no formal marker and needs none. On one side, the soil is dark and damp, weighted with silt carried down from the mountains of Central Africa across thousands of miles of slow river. On the other side, the sand begins, pale red and dry, holding almost nothing that grows, offering almost nothing to the foot that crosses onto it. The line between them is sharper than it has any right to be. A person standing at that boundary, in the early morning light or at the low orange hour before dusk, can see both territories at once, the black land reaching back toward the river, the red land stretching forward toward the horizon, and understand, without being told, that these are two different worlds governed by two different sets of rules. The ancient Egyptians looked at this boundary and understood it as something more than geography. The Deshret, the red land, was the desert, arid, foreign, ungoverned by the annual flood that made life on the black land possible. The Kemet, the black land, was the fertile strip along the Nile, the place where grain grew and settlements accumulated, and the civilization they were building had room to exist. These were not simply climatic or agricultural distinctions, they were theological ones. Each territory carried the signature of a different kind of divine power, and each was presided over by a god whose nature was inseparable from the land itself. The black land belonged to Osiris, whose body was understood as the earth made fertile, whose resurrection each year was the flood returning, whose presence was felt in every harvest. The red land belonged to Set, and what Set governed there was not evil and not absence, but a power as old and as real as anything the black land contained. Set was the presiding deity of storms and high winds, of thunder, of the open desert, and everything in it that did not answer to the ordered world of the floodplain. His domain included the foreign lands beyond Egypt's borders, the places Egyptian travelers entered at their own risk, the territories that lay outside the maps that Egyptian scribes kept carefully updated with the names of tributary peoples and neighboring kingdoms. His dominion was defined by its opposition to life, as the Nile Valley understood life, not because Set was the enemy of life in any simple sense, but because the territory he governed operated by different principles. The desert does not flood. The desert does not yield grain. The desert does not accumulate the soft, dark silt that turns to food. What the desert does is remain patient and enormous and indifferent, doing exactly what it has always done. In the way that ancient Egyptians mapped their universe, this made Set necessary. The desert existed. Storms existed. The dangerous borders of the known world existed. Someone had to hold those territories and make them coherent within the divine order, and Set held them. His domain was not a punishment or an afterthought. It was a genuine and ancient portion of the cosmos, assigned to him as the fertile land was assigned to his brother, as the sky was assigned to his sister, as magic and healing were assigned to Isis. The theological structure required his presence. The red land was real, and it needed a god. Sandstorms move across the open desert, the way Set's domain announces itself, without preamble, without gradation, as a solid thing. What begins as a slight yellowing at the edge of the sky becomes, in the space of a quarter of an hour, a wall of orange and red that swallows the horizon completely and continues moving forward toward wherever it is going. Egyptian travelers who knew the desert well would have recognized this as a specific kind of weather, predictable in its unpredictability, something that had been happening in this landscape long before any human being gave it a divine name. When they did give it a name, the name was Set, not as a personification of fear or danger, but as the recognition that whatever force governed the Red Land also governed this, that the god of the arid and the foreign and the storm was consistent, that his presence in these phenomena was theologically coherent, that the sandstorm filling the afternoon air with red grit was doing what it had always done and had always been doing under the same divine authority. Before the Hyksos period, and before the long consolidation of the Assyrian narrative cycle into its most familiar form, Set was venerated across Egypt as a god of genuine protective power. The pharaoh was understood to embody both Horus and Set, the contained order of kingship and the savage, unconquerable force that defended it at its edges. Set stood at the prow of Ra's solar bark each night as it traveled through the underworld, wielding a spear against Apep, the serpent of dissolution, whose defeat was required for the sun to rise each morning. This was not a minor function, and not a disreputable one. It was in many ways the most essential battle in the Egyptian cosmos, fought every night in the darkness below the world, won every night, the sun returning to the eastern horizon every dawn, as the evidence that it had been won again. Set won it. Set was the one who made that possible. A tradition that could hold this image of Set, alongside the image of Set as the killer of Osiris, was doing something theologically complex, maintaining two readings of the same figure without collapsing them into a simpler story. His name appears in royal names without embarrassment or complication. Seti, I, who built the great temple at Abydos, whose walls carry some of the most beautifully executed relief carvings in the history of Egyptian art. The god of the Red Land is in his name, worn as part of a royal identity, incorporated into the formal titulary of a pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, without any suggestion that this was strange or required explanation. The name means something like man of Set or he of Set, and Seti I was not the only one to carry it. Seti II followed him. Setnecht held the throne before Ramesses III, These were kings of the New Kingdom, rulers of the most powerful civilization in the Mediterranean world at its height, and they wore the god's name the way they wore their crowns, as something that added to their authority rather than complicating it, as an acknowledgement that the power of the Red Land was a kind of power worth claiming. The creature through which Set expressed himself in Egyptian art is one of the strangest and most interesting problems in the whole iconography of ancient Egypt. Egyptologists have named it the Set animal, or sometimes the Shah, and the more carefully it is described, the more clearly its strangeness becomes its point. It is depicted in profile, as Egyptian animals almost always are, and it has certain characteristics that appear consistently across centuries of representation. Rectangular ears that stand upright rather than tapering to a natural point, a tail that curves upward in a distinctive forked or arrow shape, and a long downward curving snout that does not belong to any animal that has been identified in the historical or contemporary fauna of Egypt or its surrounding territories. The animal is not a dog, it is not a donkey, it is not a jackal. Though the profile has sometimes invited that comparison, it is not an okapi or an aardvark or a saluki or any other candidate that researchers have proposed over the decades. It is something else, or perhaps it is nothing that lives, which may well be the intention. Many researchers who have spent time with this question now hold that the Set animal was deliberately invented, a creature designed by ancient artisans specifically to signal that the god it represented did not fit within the natural classifiable order of things. Egyptian religious art was precise. Horus was a falcon because falcons were real, and their attributes, their height, their speed, their predatory accuracy, carried genuine theological meaning about kingship and the sky. Anubis was a jackal because jackals were seen at the edges of cemeteries, and their habits made them appropriate symbols for a god who presided over the dead. Thoth was an ibis because ibises appeared along the Nile in ways that connected to the qualities of wisdom and scribal knowledge. These correspondences were thoughtful and deliberate. Set had no animal in the natural world whose attributes suited him, because Set was a category-breaking entity, a god whose domain included everything that fell outside the categories the natural world provided. So he was given an animal that fell outside them too. The Set animal is a creature that does not exist, rendered by craftsmen who depicted it with absolute confidence and complete consistency across thousands of years, which suggests that the ancient Egyptians knew exactly what they were drawing, even though they were drawing something no one has ever seen. When this creature appears on a temple wall, the rectangular ears upright, the curved arrow tail raised, the long snout turning downward in its distinctive arc, the image carries a particular kind of authority, not the authority of recognition, the way the falcon of Horus triggers recognition, the authority of deliberate invention, of a tradition that knew what it was doing and did it on purpose. Their Set could not be naturalized. Set could not be folded into the ordered world, the Nile flood sustained, and the scribes catalogued, and the priests maintained through ritual. He was the power at the edge of that world, the force that the world required and could not contain, and the animal that wore his name was built to embody that condition in a single, quietly impossible profile. The site of Ombos, near the modern city of Nakada in Upper Egypt, is one of the oldest known centers of religious veneration in the Nile Valley. What archaeologists have found in the layers beneath the surface there are the traces of a community that existed in the pre-dynastic period, before the first pharaohs, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, before the hieroglyphic writing system was developed well enough to record divine names with confidence. The artifacts that survive from these layers include potsherds and figurines and evidence of settlement that predates the formal establishment of the Egyptian state by centuries, and Set was worshipped there, not necessarily under a name that looks exactly like the one preserved in later texts. Ancient religious traditions do not emerge fully formed from a single moment, but the evidence of a divine power associated with this particular bend of the river, with the desert edge nearby, with the forces that the Red Land concentrated, reaches back to a time before anyone wrote his name down in a form we can read. This is worth dwelling on because it changes the scale at which Set needs to be understood. He is not a figure who appears in a narrative and plays his role and departs. He is a figure who was being addressed and honored and propitiated at this site before the narrative existed in the form it has come down through, before the pyramid texts were carved into the burial chamber of Unas at Saqqara, before the myth of Osiris's murder and resurrection had been organized into the cycle that would shape Egyptian religion for the next 3,000 years. Set was old when the story of what he did to Osiris was first written down. The Red Land he governed was old. The desert that formed the western and eastern edges of the Nile Valley was not a recent feature of the landscape. Set's presence there, whatever precise form his earliest veneration took, belongs to a layer of religious history that underlies the more familiar narrative in the way the limestone underlies the painted relief. Avaris in the northeastern Nile Delta is a different kind of site, a city whose history maps some of the most complex changes in Set's standing within Egyptian religious culture. It became the capital of the Hyksos rulers during the Second Intermediate Period, roughly between 1600 and 1550 BCE, a time when a people from Western Asia had come to control a significant portion of northern Egypt and had chosen Set as their patron deity. The Hyksos recognized in Set a god compatible with storm deities. They already venerated figures from the Near Eastern traditions who governed weather and wild forces in ways that mapped, at least loosely, onto what Set governed in the Egyptian world. Their adoption of him was not, from a theological standpoint, an obvious act of appropriation. Set was the god of foreign lands and storms and the dangerous borders of the known world, and the Hyksos rulers who made Avaris their capital were themselves a foreign presence entering Egypt through exactly the northeastern corridor that Set's domain encompassed. When Pharaoh Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt under native rule around 1550 BCE, the association between Set and the foreign occupiers was already established in Egyptian memory, and it did not dissolve with the Hyksos' departure. The damage this did to Set's reputation was slow but significant. Over the following centuries, in the long wake of Ahmose's victory, Set became more closely associated with what the Hyksos had represented: foreign rule, disruption, the chaos of occupation, and less easily separated from those associations. The kings of the 19th dynasty, who were themselves partly from the northeastern Delta region, where Set had long been venerated, could still carry his name with confidence, as Seti I did, but the trajectory was not reversing. The Hyksos' adoption of Set had begun something that would not be undone. What unfolds across the subsequent millennium and beyond is one of the slowest transformations in Egyptian religious history, the gradual narrowing of a god who had been genuinely complex, who had been protective as well as destructive, who had been the champion of Ra's solar bark as well as the killer of Osiris, into something flatter and less theologically interesting. The specific contours of Set's villainy in the Assyrian narrative became more fixed and more central. The other dimensions of his character, the protective desert guardian, the indispensable defender of the sun's nightly journey, the ancient deity venerated at Ombos before anyone wrote his name, became less available, less emphasized, less theologically legible to later periods that needed a simpler story. This process took a very long time, and it was never entirely complete during the period of pharaonic Egypt itself, but it was moving in one direction. A stone relief from the Temple of Seti I at Abydos gives a particular kind of evidence for how this complexity was once held. The pharaoh, whose name carries the Set animal hieroglyph, is shown in the formal posture of offering, the body in exact profile, one arm extended with the ritual object presented toward the divine recipient, the cartouche visible that preserves his name. The figure performing this ritual is not uncomfortable in the name he carries. The relief does not apologize for the Set animal in the cartouche, or attempt to minimize what it means. The temple at Abydos was also, it should be said, one of the great cult centers of Osiris. Seti I built his temple there precisely because of Abydos's deep association with the god his name's adversary had killed. A pharaoh named for Seti building a temple to Osiris in the site most sacred to Osiris's memory, and apparently finding no contradiction in this arrangement. That is what theological complexity looks like when it is living, when it has not yet been resolved into a simpler shape by the passage of time. The red desert beyond Ombos at night is a particular kind of darkness. There are no trees to interrupt the horizon, no buildings to hold the warmth the ground absorbed during the day. The stars that appeared above the desert to ancient Egyptian observers were the same stars they watched from the Black Land, but they looked different here, closer, perhaps, or more numerous, visible all the way to the horizon in every direction, because there was nothing to obscure them. The ancient Egyptians were careful observers of the sky, careful namers of what they saw there, attentive to the movements of stars and planets in ways that structured their religious calendar and their understanding of time. Standing in the desert at night, under that sky, it would have been easy to understand this territory as a place that belonged to a different order, not hostile, not empty in any spiritually meaningful sense, but operating by the rules of a different authority than the rules that governed the Black Land, just out of sight beyond the horizon. Set's domain, the Red Land, enormous and ancient and genuinely his, not assigned to him as a consolation or a remainder after the fertile territories had been distributed, but held by him as a god whose power was rooted in this landscape, the way Osiris's power was rooted in the flood. The two domains were not equal in the terms the human world used to measure things. The Black Land fed people, the Red Land did not. The Black Land produced the grain, and the papyrus, and the cattle, and the water that civilization required. The Red Land produced copper and turquoise, and certain kinds of hard stone, things of value if you could survive long enough to extract them, and it produced storms, and wind, and the particular terror of the open space without shade. By the terms of human survival, Osiris's territory was more useful. By the terms of the Egyptian cosmos as a theological structure, both territories were necessary, and both had always been there, and both had always needed a god. The Set animal on its temple wall, the rectangular ears raised, the curved tail arching above the body in its distinctive forked shape, the long snout drawing its impossible curve toward the ground, looks exactly the same whether it appears in a relief from the Old Kingdom, or a painting from the New Kingdom, or a carved amulet from the Ptolemaic period. The creature did not evolve toward a naturalistic rendering over time. It did not gradually come to resemble a known animal as artistic skills improved or as the tradition grew more sophisticated in its iconography. It remained precisely what it had always been, a figure that artisans rendered with absolute confidence, generation after generation, in a form that everyone recognized and no one could find in the world outside the temple walls. This consistency is itself a kind of information about what Set meant to the people who depicted him. They were not trying to show a real animal that their viewers could encounter in the desert, or the marshes, or the fields. They were trying to show something else, the idea that certain kinds of power do not fit inside the categories of the natural world, that the god of storms and foreign lands and the red desert was a force that exceeded what the natural world could classify. The Set animal is the visual equivalent of a theological proposition that there exists a kind of divine power that operates outside the boundaries the ordered world draws around itself, that this power is ancient and consistent and real, and that it will not be reduced to something more manageable by being given the face of something the viewer has seen before. The wind that comes off the desert at the edge of the Black Land is different from the wind over the Nile. There is less water in it, and something in the quality of the air shifts the moment the sand begins. The temperature drops at night more sharply. The dryness becomes noticeable in the mouth and the eyes. The sounds of the inhabited world along the river fade into a silence that is not exactly quiet, but is different from anything the valley offers. Egyptian travelers who knew this transition and knew what waited in the red land beyond it would have understood why this territory required a god of its own, why the forces governing it needed a name and a face and a cult, why there were priests at Ombos whose specific responsibility was maintaining the relationship between the human world and whatever lived in the desert's silence and the storm's approach. Set's cult at Ombos, reaching back as it does into the pre-dynastic layers of Egyptian history, represents a veneration that began before the great narrative cycle, before the story of the coffin trick and the dismemberment and the long search had crystallized into the form it would eventually hold. The people who made offerings at Ombos in those earliest periods were not setting Set in relation to Osiris, because the myth that positioned them in opposition to each other had not yet been organized in any written form. They were addressing a local power, a force associated with the desert nearby and the storms that came off it, and the dangerous territories that began where the Black Land ended. They were doing what communities living at the edges of things have always done, making some kind of relationship with whatever ruled the territory they could not easily survive in, acknowledging that it was real and ancient and deserved acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement persisted through the formalization of the Ennead at Heliopolis, through the writing down of the pyramid texts, through the New Kingdom and the Ramesside period, and the gradual hardening of the Osirian narrative into its most familiar shape. Through all of this, Ombos maintained its relationship with Set. The theological context in which that relationship was understood shifted considerably across the centuries. The god who had been addressed as a local desert power was folded into a larger cosmological structure, given a specific position in a divine family, assigned a role in the great drama of the murder of Osiris that made him a specific kind of figure in a specific kind of story. But the site and the practice persisted, carrying into the later periods something of the older, simpler acknowledgement that the Red Land was real, that its god was real, that both had been there long before anyone organized them into a narrative. The boundary between the Black Land and the Red Land still exists in the places along the Nile where the geography has not been significantly altered. In the region near Luxor, or near Nakada where ancient Ombos stood, a person can still stand at the line where the dark soil stops and the pale sand begins, and look both ways at once, back toward the river and the green strip of cultivation, forward into the desert and the silence. The sharpness of the line is still remarkable, still something that makes the two territories feel genuinely different in a way that goes beyond the visual. What the ancient Egyptians did with that boundary was give it the character of a theological distinction that their entire religious and cosmological system was built to reflect. The black land was Osiris. The red land was Set. These were not metaphors that required unpacking. They were the landscape itself, described in the terms that made it most fully intelligible to the people who lived within it. Set's power was in that landscape, in the sandstorm that approached from the west in a wall of orange light, in the wind that carried grit off the dunes and into the valley, in the silence of the desert after dark, when the stars were visible all the way to the ground. It was an enormous power. It was an ancient power, and the creature that wore its face on temple walls across thousands of years, the quadruped with the rectangular ears and the impossible snout and the tail raising its arrow shape above the body, was drawn by hands that understood exactly what they were rendering, even though the creature they drew had never walked in the desert or anywhere else in the physical world. There it stands on the temple wall, the Set animal, in its particular and unchanging form. The ears rise in their rectangular posture. The tail curves above the haunches in its distinctive forked shape. The long snout draws its gradual arc downward from the forehead toward the ground. It is shown in profile, as all sacred animals were shown, with the absolute confidence of a tradition that has been depicting this creature for so long that the hand that carves it no longer needs to consider what it looks like. The form is simply known, held in the body of every artisan trained to reproduce it. One of Egypt's oldest and most powerful gods, rendered in the form of something that has never been seen outside the walls that carry it, something no one has been able to name and no one has needed to name, because the image itself, these ears, this tail, this impossible snout, is the name, and it has been recognizable since before the first pharaoh sat on any throne, and it will remain recognizable for as long as the stone that carries it holds its surface. Whatever it is very old. Whatever it is, it belongs to the Red Land, and the Red Land has always been there, steady and enormous, on the other side of that sharp and unremarkable line where the dark soil stops and the pale sand begins. Osiris came home the way a king who has been long awaited returns, not in hurry, not in ceremony, but in the quiet, settled manner of someone who knows that the doors will open before he reaches them. According to Plutarch's account of the myth, written in the 1st century of the Common Era, but drawing on sources and traditions far older than that, Osiris had been abroad. He had traveled through the known lands beyond Egypt, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, carrying with him the arts of civilization, the turning of soil, the planting of grain, the ordering of law, the forms of religious observance. Wherever he went, the tradition holds. He was received with the kind of welcome that belongs to someone who brings with him what a place did not have before, and now he was returning. There was a feast prepared in his honor. The hall would have been lit, full of voices, the smell of food and wine, and the particular warmth of a large room where many people have gathered in celebration. Osiris came home, and the table was already set, and there was no reason for any of it to feel like anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. It is worth holding that image for a moment. Not the feast as it would eventually become, not the night as it would eventually end, but the feast as it began. Because the Egyptian mythological tradition is not, at its deepest level, a tradition concerned with explaining how a wicked man did a wicked thing. It is a tradition concerned with structure, with the way certain forces relate to one another across time, with the positions that the cosmos requires certain figures to occupy, and with the question of what happens when those positions are not in alignment, and to understand the weight of what Set had accumulated by the time Osiris returned from his journey abroad. It is necessary to understand not a moment of sudden grievance, but something much slower and more architecturally interesting, the long arrangement of the world that had left one brother standing at the center of everything that mattered, and left the other standing at the edge of what the fertile world called its own. Osiris, in the Egyptian tradition, was not simply a king. He was the first king, the figure through whom, the myth holds, the institution of organized human rule first took its proper form. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE, preserves a version of the tradition in which Osiris civilized humanity, not through conquest, but through persuasion, and through what might be translated as the arts of culture, music, agriculture, the rituals that bind a people together in shared observance of the sacred. This was the specific quality of his kingship, that it was earned not by force, but by right, that it moved through the world the way Mot, the cosmic principle of truth and right order, was understood to move, naturally, inevitably, as water moves to low ground. To be in the presence of Osiris's reign was to be in the presence of the world, working as it was meant to. The grain grew, the Nile returned each year with its dark, renewing water, the festivals were observed, the order of things held. He was also the eldest son, in both divine and human royal succession, as the Egyptians understood it. Primogeniture, the inheritance of the firstborn, was the principle that governed the transmission of legitimate authority. When Geb, the earth god, the divine father of the 4 siblings, formally awarded the kingship and dominion over the fertile land of Egypt to Osiris, he was following a structure that was itself already ancient, a principle embedded not in personal preference, but in the cosmological order that Geb himself embodied. The earth gave the inheritance to the eldest, as the earth had always done, as the tradition required it to do. Set had not been overlooked through malice or accident. He had been positioned by the structure of birth and of divine decree together, outside the line of legitimate succession. The throne was never his to begin with, and that fact, simple, enormous, not in any way the result of anything Set had done or failed to do, sat at the center of everything that followed. The marriage of Osiris to Isis made that positioning more specific still. Within the Ennead of Heliopolis, the 9-deity family, whose interrelationships formed the theological architecture of the Egyptian cosmos, Isis was understood to be the most magically powerful of all the gods. The ancient texts preserve many accounts of her skill, her knowledge, her capacity to act on the world through the force of what the tradition called Heka, divine magic. She would later, in accounts that survive from across many centuries of Egyptian religious literature, deceive Ra himself into revealing his secret name, the deepest, most hidden form of any divine being's true nature, and through that name gain power over the king of the gods. She possessed the ability to bring the dead back to animation. She knew the forms of birds and could take them. She could search the length of Egypt and not be stopped by what lay in her way. To be married to Isis was not simply to have a consort, it was to have access to a kind of combined power, legitimate royal authority fused to supreme magical competence that made the rule of Osiris not merely a political fact, but a cosmological one. Set, by contrast, was formally paired with Nephthys, and Nephthys, whose name translates roughly as Lady of the House, occupied a position in the divine family that the tradition itself seems to have understood as ambiguous. She was assigned as Set's consort. Her hieroglyphic emblem, a basket resting on a house, rose above her head in the formal rendering of her image. She was his wife in the cosmological diagram, but in the funerary texts across centuries of Egyptian religious literature, she appears consistently at the side of Osiris and Isis, rather than at the side of her own husband. She mourns Osiris. She assists Isis in the search. She raises her arms in the formal gesture of lamentation over a body that was not her husband's, in rituals from which Set was entirely absent. Whatever the mythological marriage of Set and Nephthys was supposed to represent, it did not represent a loyalty that bent toward Set in the moments that tested it. He was, in the formal arrangement of the cosmos, paired with a wife who had chosen in every way that mattered to belong to the other side of the story. This is the shape of what Set possessed, and the shape of what he did not possess, before anything happened between him and his brother that the myth specifically records. His desert domain was ancient and real, a vast wind-scoured territory defined by everything the fertile land was not, and it was entirely, genuinely his. The red land stretched away from the Nile's floodplain in all directions, the pale sand beginning exactly where the dark soil ended, the boundary sharp enough to stand at and see. As the presiding deity of storms and high winds, and the desert, and all that was arid and foreign, and outside the reach of the Nile's returning water, Set ruled a territory that ancient Egyptians understood as theologically necessary. The desert was not a place that could be wished away. The storms came whether invited or not. The red land held whatever the black land could not absorb. Set's domain existed because the Egyptian cosmos required it to exist, because Mat, the order of things, defined itself against what it was not, and what it was not was Set's territory. He was not powerless. He was not without a place in the structure of the world. He had simply been assigned a place that the world the Egyptians lived in most fully, the Black Land, the fertile valley, the place of the annual flood and the growing grain, and the ordered human settlement could only ever look toward as its opposite. There is a passage in the work of the Egyptologist Herman Tevelde, writing in his 1967 study of Set's theological position, that tries to name what this meant with precision. Tevelde argued that Set's violence cannot be understood as irrational jealousy alone, or as the simple expression of a wicked character doing what wicked characters do. What the myth describes in Tevelde's reading is the inevitable expression of a force that was cosmologically necessary, but structurally uncontained. Set had a domain. He did not have a throne, where his power was real, enormous, ancient, woven into the fabric of what the world was, and it had no place within the ordered structure of the world to legitimately rest. Osiris sat on the throne that Mate placed him upon, the throne that would have given Set's power a form the world could recognize did not exist. There was no position in the arrangement of legitimate divine authority that was shaped to hold what Set was. And the tradition, Tevelde observed, did not present this as Set's failure. It presented it as a structural fact of the cosmos, a fact as old as the family itself. This is the arrangement into which Osiris returned from his journey abroad. He came home to a feast held in his honor, in a hall warm with light and voices, and he was the king of a land that had flourished in his absence, married to the most powerful goddess in the divine order, the firstborn son of the earth and sky, who had inherited the world's most fertile territory by right and by divine decree. He carried with him the authority of Meta, the quality of a man whose kingship was not something he had seized, but something the cosmos itself had produced. His return was not a provocation. It was not an act of cruelty. It was simply the return of the rightful order in all its settled, unassailable completeness to a world that had held its shape while he was away. And it is worth sitting with that simplicity for a moment, because the tradition is not trying to make Osiris into something complicated. He was the king. He was what a king was supposed to be. The tradition offers this not as irony, but as a factual statement about the structure of the divine family, and the factual statement was itself, for Set, enough. The weight of what Osiris had is not easy to summarize, because it was not located in any single thing. It was located in the accumulation, the way each element of his position compounded the others, the way the kingship and the marriage and the divine decree and the legitimate lineage all reinforced each other, forming something dense and interlocking that had no gap in it, large enough for anything Set might claim to enter. The crook and flail, crossed against the white linen of Osiris's mummiform depiction, were not simply the symbols of a king, they were the symbols of a king whose claim to those symbols was itself guaranteed by every level of the cosmic order simultaneously. He was recognized by his father, the earth. His wife's power protected and extended his own. The fertile land produced its grain each year, as if in confirmation of his legitimacy. The people he had taught to plant and to observe the festivals recognized him as the source of what they had. There was no fissure in it. Against this, Set's position requires some careful attention, because the tradition does not simply depict him as standing outside in the cold looking inward at warmth. It depicts him as standing in his own enormous territory, ruling a domain that was genuinely his. The storm, the desert, the high wind, the arid places, and finding that none of it was what the world recognized as the thing that mattered. The image of Osiris, as the ancient Egyptians painted him, is instructive here. Wrapped in white linen, his skin green for the vegetation that was his domain, the attiter crown with its white feathers rising above his head, the crook and flail crossed with the specific formality of a figure who has always held them and expects to go on holding them. He is painted in the posture of absolute stillness. There is nothing in his posture that acknowledges the possibility of change. The image is designed to communicate permanence, and the permanence it communicates is the permanence of Ma'at, which means that anything that would disturb it was by definition the opposite of Ma'at. Whatever Set felt or understood or desired, it existed outside the order that Osiris embodied. It had no legitimate form inside that order. The structure of the cosmos did not include a place where Set's desire for a throne could be accommodated. The tradition also preserves, within the broader mythological cycle, an account of something that crossed even this. Among the ancient sources dealing with the Osirian cycle, there runs a claim, repeated across enough tellings to have settled into the structure of the myth, that Osiris fathered a child, not with Isis, but with Nephthys. The child was Anubis, who would become the jackal-headed god of embalming and the guardian of the dead, the figure depicted in the precise formal posture of the weighing of the heart, whose expertise in death was as complete and confident as any divine specialist's. The circumstances of Anubis's conception, as the most widely cited version holds, involved Nephthys disguising herself as Isis to approach Osiris, meaning that the boundary had been crossed not through simple transgression, but through an act of deliberate concealment, one party mistaken, the other seeking something she did not have. The Egyptologist's interest in this episode is not primarily moral, it is structural. What the episode does within the architecture of the myth is complete the account of what Set did not possess. He had been given no throne by the divine decree of Geb. He had been assigned a wife who oriented herself toward his enemies in every situation that mattered. And the wife who was supposed to be his, whose loyalty was supposed to anchor the intimate interior of his personal domain, had sought and found the things she wanted inside the same boundary he was being kept from crossing. The territory that was exclusively Set's, the one boundary in the entire arrangement that the kingship and the marriage and the divine decree could not reach, had been entered. The Red Land was vast. The storms were real. The god of the desert was ancient and genuine. And the intimate ground of his own household had not been secure either. It is important to be precise about what the tradition is and is not doing with this. The myth is not building a psychological portrait of Set as a wounded man whose humiliation makes his violence understandable in the modern therapeutic sense. Egyptian mythological texts do not work that way. What the tradition is doing is something more architectural, cataloging the positions in the cosmic diagram and their interrelationships, noting where the alignment between domain and power and legitimate authority was complete, and noting where it was not. Set's position was one in which the misalignment was total. He had real power and no legitimate throne. He had a wife who belonged in her deepest orientation to someone else. He had an enormous domain that the world that called itself ordered did not recognize as the place from which legitimate authority could issue. He had been positioned by birth and divine decree outside every structure that the Egyptian cosmos used to confirm the value of power. The myth does not explain Set's violence by saying Set was consumed by rage. It explains Set's violence by drawing a precise diagram of a cosmic arrangement in which Set had been placed where the structure had no room for him. Geb, the earth, the father of all four siblings, the god whose own body was the ground that everything grew from, is depicted in Egyptian relief in his characteristic posture, reclining. The land itself, one arm sometimes raised in the formal gesture that ancient visual programs used to indicate the transmission of inheritance. In the images that show Geb pointing toward Osiris, the gesture does not have the quality of an arbitrary choice. It has the quality of a natural force taking its natural direction, as inevitable as water finding the lowest ground, as unchosen as the tilt of the land. Geb did not give the kingship to Osiris out of affection, the tradition implies. He gave it to Osiris because that was what the cosmic order required the earth to do. The eldest, the legitimate, the one through whom Mat flowed, the inheritance went there, the way inheritance always went, the way the Nile went north. And Set, watching this, not from ambition, the tradition suggests, not from malice in its simplest form, but from the position in which the cosmos had placed him, received nothing that the world called a throne. The image of Isis sheltering something beneath her wings is one of the most persistent in the entire Egyptian visual tradition. She appears in this posture across millennia, across different materials, on tomb walls and papyrus and funerary furniture, seated, wings outstretched in their protective arc, her face turned forward, the hieroglyph of her name balancing perfectly above her head. The quality of the image is not warmth exactly. It is something more specific, a calm and absolute competence, the image of a power that knows precisely what it is protecting and precisely how to go on protecting it. Whatever she was sheltering was safe, and the image communicated this not through softness, but through confidence. In the story of Osiris and Set, Isis sheltered the king. She extended her own incomparable magical capacity around the authority he embodied. Together they formed a unit that had no equivalent in the divine order. Legitimate kingship and supreme magical power combined mutually reinforcing, without any gap between them that an outside force could use as a point of entry. Set had no equivalent pairing. He had Nephthys, who mourned his victims. He had the desert, which was vast and ancient, and his own and entirely outside the territory the world recognized as the place legitimate power issued from. He had the storms and the high wind, and the particular authority of everything arid and foreign and beyond the floodplain. And he had, in the specific accounting of the mythological tradition, the position of a figure whose cosmic necessity was real. The red land was genuinely necessary, the desert was genuinely there, and whose cosmic legitimacy within the ordered world had no formal structure to rest upon. The pyramid texts carved into the burial chamber of Pharaoh Unas at Saqqara around 2375 BCE already assume all of this as background. They do not explain the conflict between the brothers. They do not provide an account of how the resentment formed or what its precise contours were. They treat the situation of Osiris and Set as something the reader already knows, something whose origins are further back than the first writing, something that was old when it was first inscribed in those narrow limestone corridors, with their columns of blue hieroglyphs, floor to ceiling. The text refer to Set in oblique, careful language, as the one who threw Osiris down, as the one who acted against him, and they do so as though naming a category of force that requires no further explanation, not because the story was simple, because it was already, by the time anyone first carved it, completely understood. The jackal-headed figure of Anubis appears in the funerary papyri in the precise formal posture of the weighing of the heart, attending to the scale, his movements exact, his expertise undeniable. He was born of a union that crossed a boundary that tradition acknowledged had been crossed. He became the master of death and embalming, the guide of the newly dead, the one who presided over the judgment of souls. Whatever the circumstances of his origin were, they did not define what he became. The tradition folded his strange beginning into his quiet, authoritative expertise without apparent difficulty. He was the son of Osiris and Nephthys, born from the particular alignment of a divine power, seeking what it needed, and he carried the knowledge of death the way a god carries what he was made for. The strange circumstances of his beginning were simply part of the diagram, part of the elaborate and interlocking arrangement that placed each figure in a precise relationship to each other, creating through those relationships the theological structure the Egyptian cosmos required. Set's territory, the desert beyond Ombos, the red sand stretching away from the Nile in the ancient landscape of Upper Egypt, was genuinely enormous. It was genuinely ancient. The worship of Set in the bend of the river near Nakata extended back into the pre-dynastic period, back before the first pharaohs, back before anyone had written the god's name down and expected another person to read it. The storms he presided over came from the south and the west, real storms that travelers encountered in the real desert, that turned the air orange and swallowed the horizon. The arid territory that was his was not a metaphor for marginalization. It was a physical fact, miles of pale red sand and rock, the wind moving through it without direction, the sky above it enormous and clear. Set ruled something that was real, something that was old, something that the world the Egyptians lived in could not have been without. And the world that called itself ordered, the world of the Black Land and the Nile flood, and the growing grain, and the legitimate kingship of Osiris, did not include within its structure a throne that was shaped to hold this power. The tradition does not fully explain, in any single text, whether Set understood the structure that had placed him where he was, or whether he experienced it as an accumulation of specific grievances. The myth does not work that way. What it preserves instead is a diagram, the positions of each figure clearly drawn, the relationships precisely mapped, the territory of each carefully bounded. And what the diagram shows, when held up to the light, is a cosmic arrangement in which one figure possessed the kingship and the fertile land and the divine decree of the earth, and the most magically powerful goddess in the divine order as his partners, and in which the figure positioned as his opposite possessed a vast and ancient domain that the world of ordered life could only ever look at from across the sharpest possible boundary. Osiris sat on the throne that Meek required him to sit on. Isis sheltered what she had always sheltered. Geb rested beneath everything, his inheritance already given, in the direction that the cosmic order had always required it to go. And Set stood in his desert, enormous, ancient, the wind moving through it without hurry, the stars overhead in their counted courses, the red sand holding its color in the dark, in the territory that was his, and that offered no form the ordered world would recognize as a throne. That is the full weight of what had accumulated by the time Osiris came home from his journey abroad. Not a single moment, not a sudden eruption of feeling. Something architectural, a structure built over the entire duration of the world, with each element placed carefully against the next until the arrangement was complete, and there was no longer any gap in it for anything to enter except by force. The feast was warm and lit when Osiris returned. The voices of the guests filled the hall. The decorated chest would arrive later, but what had already arrived, long before that night, was the complete and precise arrangement of a cosmos that had given one figure everything the world recognized as the center of value, and had given the other figure everything that was real and ancient and entirely genuinely his own, and had called his everything the desert, and had drawn the boundary sharp enough that a person could stand at it and see both sides simultaneously. The desert at night, beyond Ombos, is a particular kind of quiet. The stars overhead are the stars the ancient Egyptians named and tracked, Orion rising, Sirius returning, the sky circuits that the priestly observers understood as the clock of the cosmos, the timepiece by which the flood and the planting and the harvest were all measured. The red sand holds the heat of the day for a while and then releases it slowly into the cold night air. The wind moves through it the way the wind always moves through the desert, not with purpose, not with destination, but with the particular quality of a force that is ancient and indifferent and entirely its own. This was Set's territory. The storms that crossed it were his. The arid, foreign, wind-scoured expanse of everything that the Nile's water did not reach was his domain, genuinely and from the oldest periods of Egyptian religious life. He was a real god with a real domain, ancient and powerful, venerated at Ombos long before the first dynasty, and carrying the force of the storms in the desert through the entire length of Egyptian theological time. And in all that vastness, across all those miles of pale red sand and enormous dark sky and wind moving without destination, there was no throne, there was no form of power that the ordered world would call legitimate. There was only the desert, and the stars above it, and the boundary at its edge, where the black land began, and the world that Osiris ruled resumed its settled, rightful, unassailable claim on everything that grew. The feast had been going for some time when the chest arrived. Plutarch, writing in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, describes the scene with the particular unhurried clarity of someone who has read widely and chosen carefully what to set down. Osiris had returned recently from abroad, from a long journey through foreign lands, where, in the tradition's telling, He had spent his time not making war, but teaching, moving through distant territories with the quality of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be followed. The hall was full. There were guests from across the divine order, torchlight, and the smell of food, the ordinary richness of a gathering held in honor of a king who had come home. What Plutarch emphasizes, before anything else happens, is how normal it all looked. The chest came in looking like a gift. It was not a plain thing. Plutarch is specific about this. The chest had been made by craftsmen, decorated, built with the kind of care that signals value before a single question has been asked about its purpose. It was carried into the hall and admired, the way beautiful objects in a feast hall are admired, passed from one appraisal to the next. The proportions were exact. The wood was fine. Set had arranged for it to be built to precise measurements. Measurements, the tradition holds, that corresponded exactly to the body of his brother. But nothing in the object's appearance announced this. It arrived as a beautiful chest arrives. It was handled the way a gift is handled. Set then made his proposal. Whoever lay inside the chest and found that it fit them perfectly, Set announced, would be given the chest as a gift. The guests tried. One after another, the figures at the feast lowered themselves into the decorated box and found it too wide, or too short, or wrong in some other way that prevented it from closing properly around them. The chest did not fit, and the chest did not fit, and then Osiris stepped inside. The tradition describes no hesitation. Osiris lay down inside the chest, and the chest closed around him perfectly, because it had been built for no one else, and because no one had told him what that meant. Set and his co-conspirators sealed the lid. Plutarch specifies that they used molten lead. The chest that had arrived looking like a gift was nailed shut and sealed and lifted and carried through the hall and outside into the Egyptian night, and then cast into the Nile. The number Plutarch gives for Set's conspirators is 72. This is a large number for a premeditated act, large enough to suggest not a private crime, but something closer to an organized removal. A coup conducted under the social cover of a celebration. The conspiracy large enough that it could not have been assembled at the last moment, could not have been decided on impulse. 72 is also, the scholars who study these numbers have noted, the number of years required for the precession of the equinoxes to shift 1 degree across the night sky, a precision that suggests the number may carry astronomical significance, as well as conspiratorial scale. Whether that significance was intended by the tradition's earliest tellers, or noticed by later readers and allowed to stand because it seemed appropriate, is not entirely clear. What remains is the number, specific and recorded, given by Plutarch without explanation. The Nile received the chest without ceremony. This is worth dwelling on for a moment. The way the river is described in the tradition's telling, not as a witness, but as a medium, indifferent and continuous, doing what it has always done. The chest moved into the current, and the current carried it northward toward the delta. The river did not slow for what it was carrying. The reeds along the bank bent the way they always bend in the dark, pressed by water moving past them toward the sea. The chest traveled through the night, on a river that had been moving in exactly this way for longer than the tradition had language to describe, and what it carried north with the current was the sealed body of the god who had ruled everything, the flood made fertile. Isis found out. The tradition is not always precise about exactly how or exactly when. In some accounts, she was elsewhere when it happened. In others, she sensed the change in the quality of the world, the way a god might sense it, through some disturbance in the structure of things that had no visible form. What the tradition is consistent about is what she did next. She searched. Plutarch describes her moving through the marshes of the delta, asking everyone she encountered whether they had seen the chest, following the reports of children who played near the river and had noticed something drifting past. In some strands of the tradition, she took the form of a bird, a kite, the ancient sources say, moving above the water and the reeds, and in others she simply moved through the landscape in her own form, the search covering the geography of Egypt from the delta southward and then beyond Egypt's borders, following the report that the current had carried the chest all the way to the coast of Byblos on the Levantine shore, where a great tree had grown around it and encased it entirely within its trunk, and the tree had been cut down and used as a pillar in the palace of the local king. Plutarch tells this part of the story with a strange, specific beauty. Isis arrived at Byblos and sat quietly near the palace, speaking with no one. The queen's servants came to draw water, and she braided their hair and scented them with a perfume that emanated from her skin. And when the queen noticed this and asked who had done it, Isis was brought to the palace and given a position there, caring for the queen's child. She held the infant over the fire each night to strip away its mortality, and the queen, coming upon this scene, cried out and broke the enchantment. Isis revealed herself, asked for the pillar, and was given it. She opened the tree and found the chest inside, and inside the chest she found her husband, and the tradition holds that she knelt over the body and wept there, alone on the Levantine coast, with the chest open beside her and the tree broken open around it, and the sound of the sea somewhere nearby. She brought the body back to Egypt. Set found it. The tradition does not always specify the circumstances of this discovery. In some accounts he was out hunting in the marshes at night when he came upon the body. In others there is simply the fact of his finding it, without the geography or the hour. What comes after the finding is consistent across the accounts. Set took the body of Osiris and cut it into pieces and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Plutarch gives the number as 14. Other ancient sources, particularly those from Upper Egypt, give the number as 42, one piece for each of Egypt's traditional administrative districts, as though the dismemberment had a territorial logic, as though the god's body was being distributed across the land in a way that mirrored how land itself was divided and administered. The two numbers have coexisted in the tradition for a very long time. They do not cancel each other out so much as they suggest that different regions, different temple complexes, different centuries had their own ways of accounting for what Set had done, each version carrying its own local specificity about where a piece of the god had fallen and where it had been found. The pyramid texts approach all of this obliquely. They are the oldest written evidence for the Osiris mythology, inscribed in the burial chamber of Pharaoh Unas at Saqqara, in the pyramid he built there toward the end of the 24th century before the Common Era. The chamber itself is not large. The ceiling is low, the walls close, the room small enough that a person standing in the center of it could touch both walls by extending their arms. Every available surface of that stone room, floor, ceiling, walls, is covered in columns of hieroglyphs incised into the limestone and filled with blue pigment, the color of sky and water and lapis lazuli, so that the entire chamber seems lit from within by a faint and ancient blue. The texts do not narrate the myth the way Plutarch does. They are spells, formulas, declarations intended to move the dead king through the underworld and into the company of the gods, and they reference the mythology of Osiris, not as a story being told, but as a structure already known, a framework the reader is assumed to already inhabit. Set is named in these texts as the one who threw Osiris to the ground. The phrase is careful, circumspect, choosing a description rather than a direct account of the act. The texts were not written to explain what happened. They were written in the knowledge that what happened was already fully understood by everyone in the tradition, fully understood, fully settled, already ancient. This is one of the things that the pyramid texts quietly establish. By the time these spells were carved into the limestone of Unis's burial chamber, the mythology of Osiris was not new. It was already a framework ancient enough to be used as a reference point for royal funerary ritual, already established enough that it required no introduction or explanation, already old enough that the scribes who composed these spells were themselves drawing on something they had inherited rather than invented. The oldest writing in Egypt was written in the presence of a story older than the writing. What Isis did with the pieces is described across multiple sources with varying degrees of detail, but the central action is consistent across all of them. She searched again. She and her sister Nephthys, Set's own wife, who had long since made clear in the tradition where her loyalties in this conflict lay, moved through Egypt gathering what had been scattered. Each fragment was found, according to the tradition, and attended to, and in most versions of the account Osiris was then temporarily restored, his body gathered and wrapped, his mummified form, the first mummification, the first instance of the funerary rite that would define Egyptian mortuary practice for 3,000 years. The god Anubis appears in connection with this, as he appears in connection with all funerary preparation. His role in the earliest phases of the tradition is as the one who presides over the wrapping and preservation of the body, a role the ancient sources associate with the first application of these rites to the body of Osiris himself. Later Egyptian funerary painting shows Anubis at the preparation table, upright and exact, performing with absolute calm the careful work of preserving what has been broken. The jackal head is turned in profile, the hands precise, the posture formal without being cold. He does not appear to find the work unusual. He appears to find it entirely within the scope of what he does and what he has always done and what he will always do. Isis conceived Horus in the period of Osiris's temporary restoration. The tradition holds that she took the form of a bird and hovered above the mummy, drawing from her husband the life that was still faintly present in the reassembled body before it passed entirely into the land of the dead. The child who was conceived in this way would grow to be Horus, the Avenger, the eventual inheritor of his father's kingship, the god who would bring the conflict with Set to its long adjudication before the divine court. But that is a different part of the story. What belongs to this moment is only the fact of conception, the act through which death was made to produce something that would outlast it, the seed of the continuation placed in the exact moment between Osiris's two deaths. The chest became a container for a different kind of meaning once Osiris had been removed from it. Plutarch's account is the most complete narration of the sequence, written by a Greek scholar working in a period when Egypt had already been under Roman administration for well over a century, drawing on temple sources and local informants and earlier written accounts, some of which no longer survive. His version is layered, Greek in its narrative architecture, Egyptian in the mythological substance it preserves, Roman in the historical moment it was composed in. The scholars who study Plutarch's use of Egyptian sources note that he was working carefully, that his account preserves details that are corroborated by much older Egyptian texts, even where his framing is clearly his own. The story he tells is not identical to any single ancient Egyptian source, but it is not simply invented either. It is a late transmission of something very old, and the chest at its center, The beautiful decorated box built to exact measurements has been there from the beginning. Abydos in Upper Egypt became the place where the tradition located Osiris most permanently. It is a site at the edge of the desert, the cultivated black land ending there, as it ends everywhere in Egypt, sharply, without transition, the red sand beginning at the exact point where the flood's reach stops. Ancient Egyptians traveled to Abydos on pilgrimage. They asked to be buried there, or to have cenotaphs there, monuments placed near the god of the dead to ensure proximity to his presence and his judgment. The cliff faces near Abydos hold rock-cut tombs from the earliest dynasties. The site was venerated before and through and after every change in Egyptian political power, through conquest and occupation and the rise and fall of dynasties, the veneration continuous across the kind of time that makes most human institutions seem momentary. At Abydos, each year, the tradition was enacted in public. Ancient Egyptians held what the scholars call passion plays at this site, ritual reenactments of the death of Osiris, his mourning, the gathering of his pieces, and ultimately his restoration. These were not private ceremonies conducted by priests in closed temple spaces, but public events, attended by large numbers of people, enacted on the landscape of the site itself, with processions and mourning, and the final ritual resolution in which the god was restored and the world continued. The events of the myth were spoken aloud, enacted bodily, mourned genuinely, and then answered by the restoration that the tradition always provided. This happened each year. It happened for centuries. The persistence of this ritual is worth sitting with for a moment. The way the tradition required not only that the story be preserved in writing and in temple imagery, but that it be bodily reenacted, returned to the landscape of Abydos, year after year, given back to the air, in the voices of the people who had made the journey to be present. Every year the chest appeared in the tradition's ceremonial form. Every year Osiris was mourned. Every year the gathering of pieces was enacted, and the restoration arrived, and the world was shown to continue. The individual who attended the rites at Abydos in, say, the 20th year of Ramesses II's long reign, and then returned home to the Delta, was connected by that attendance to every other person who had stood in that same landscape and witnessed the same enactment, reaching back through time to a period before writing, to the earliest formations of the mythology, to moments the tradition itself acknowledged as ancient, when those moments were already being performed in front of an audience who came from across the country to see them. The chest floated north on the Nile. The pieces were scattered and then gathered. The mummy was wrapped, and the mourning was performed, and the resurrection was accomplished through the specific particular magic of the goddess, who had followed the current to the Levantine coast and opened a tree to find what was inside it. These are the events as the tradition holds them, from Plutarch's feast hall and the molten lead that sealed the lid to the blue-painted walls of Unis's burial chamber at Saqqara, where the same story was already ancient when the scribes first carved it. The site of Abydos, where the enactments were held, stands in that particular position in the Egyptian landscape, where both territories are simultaneously visible. From certain points on the site's edge, the black land and the red land are both present, the fertile strip of the floodplain on one side, the desert beginning on the other, the two colors that ancient Egyptians understood as two cosmological territories, occupying the same field of vision at once. The territory of the god who ruled the fertile land and the territory of the god who ruled the desert, both present from the same vantage point, the boundary between them exact. The tradition that placed the central mourning rituals for Osiris at this specific location at the edge of the cultivated world, within sight of the desert, had made that choice knowing what both territories meant. Abydos was not simply a convenient location, it was a theologically charged one, a place where the two halves of the Egyptian cosmological map could be held in view together, where the meaning of the conflict between the two brothers was written directly in the landscape around the worshippers who had come to enact it. The pyramid texts at Saqqara were carved for a single dead king and intended to ensure his passage through the underworld. The annual rites at Abydos were performed for thousands of people over hundreds of years. Plutarch's account was written in Greek for readers in a Roman world who might never have visited Egypt. The Osiris mythology traveled through all of these different containers, burial chamber, and open landscape, and scholarly text without losing its central structure, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. The chest, the river, the search, the gathering, the wrapping. These elements survived the change from hieroglyphic spell to Greek prose narrative, from private royal funerary text to public annual ceremony, from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period and beyond, the same sequence of events holding its shape across the kind of time that reshaped almost everything else in the world around it. What the rites at Abydos restored, year after year, was not only Osiris, they restored the continuity of the tradition itself, the living link between the current year's mourners and every previous generation that had stood in the same place and performed the same mourning and witnessed the same restoration. The chest was not only a container for the body, the rite was not only a performance of a myth. The annual gathering at the desert's edge was the tradition maintaining itself, actively, in the bodies and voices of the people who had traveled there and would travel home afterward and return the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, for as long as the tradition continued. The Nile moved north at night the way it has always moved. The reeds bent, the chest traveled in the dark on a current that did not record what it was carrying and did not distinguish this night from any other night. The river went where rivers go, carrying what it was given, arriving eventually at the sea, and somewhere on the shores of the delta, where the river slows and spreads, and the water becomes brackish and the papyrus grows thick, Isis searched through the marshes in the form of a bird, moving low over the dark water, looking. The scholars who study the Passion plays at Abydos note that these rituals were held at the time of the annual flood, the inundation that ancient Egyptians understood as the return of Osiris's life-giving power, the dark silt-laden water spreading across the fields and making the black land black again. The timing was deliberate. The rites were held when the Nile was doing what it always did at that season, the flood arriving as it had arrived every year since before the tradition had words for what the flood meant, the agricultural cycle continuing beneath and through, and despite everything that the myth described as having been done to the god who made it possible. In the burial chamber of Unas at Saqqara, the blue columns of text cover the walls in every direction. A person standing in that small room is entirely surrounded by the oldest written evidence that this family's story was already being told, that the murder had already happened in the tradition's reckoning, that the chest had already sealed and the river had already carried what was inside it, and the search had already found what it was looking for. All of this already complete, already established, already ancient enough to serve as the foundation for the funerary spells of a dead king who needed the structure of the myth to move him safely through the underworld. The chamber is low and small, the walls are close. The light, when the modern visitor brings a torch inside, catches the edges of the carved hieroglyphs and makes them visible in relief. The incised lines holding shadow, while the surfaces around them reflect light. The blue pigment that originally filled those carved lines has survived in places and faded in others, so that the text moves between vivid color and pale stone in irregular patterns that have nothing to do with the meaning of the words and everything to do with the 4,000 years of air and shadow the chamber has held since Unas was placed inside it. The story those walls tell had been old when they were carved. It was being told at Abydos when Plutarch was a child. It was being told in one form or another when the Roman Empire was consolidating its hold on Egypt, and would continue to be told in modified forms, in Coptic and in Gnostic texts, in the writings of the Church Fathers, who referenced the Egyptian tradition without always understanding it, in the libraries of Renaissance scholars who found Plutarch's account and read it with wide interest, in the works of the first European Egyptologists who traveled to Abydos in the 19th century and found the stones of the Passion Plays still present in the landscape, still marking the place where the annual rites had been held for longer than anyone could precisely calculate. And year after year at Abydos, while all of this happened, the worshippers gathered at the edge of the desert. The chest appeared in its ceremonial form. The morning was spoken. The pieces were gathered. The restoration arrived. The flood came in its season, and the black soil spread across the red edge of the desert, and the grain that would follow was already made inevitable by the water still moving slowly across the land. And the story that had been told for as long as the tradition could remember was told again, and the people who had come to hear it and enact it returned home. And the year turned, and the Nile moved north in the dark, carrying everything the current was given, arriving where rivers arrive, which is where they have always been going. The tradition holds the chest, and the river, and the search, and the scattering, and the gathering all at once, all of it present in the same structure that has been passing from one generation to the next for longer than most of what the world calls ancient. The blue walls at Saqqara stand. The site at Abydos persists at the edge of the desert where it has always been. Plutarch's account survives in manuscripts copied and recopied across the Mediterranean world through centuries of transmission. The story traveled through all of these containers: the burial chamber, the passion play, the scholarly text, the temple relief, the funerary papyrus, the carved stone at the desert's edge, each one holding a slightly different version of the same sequence, the chest sealed, and the river taking it, and the search beginning in the dark of the delta marshes, the form of a bird moving low above the water, looking and eventually finding what she was looking for. This is where the telling rests for now, at Abydos, in the season of the flood, the dark water spreading across the fields at the height of the inundation. The mourners gathered as they gathered each year, the ritual enacted as it had been enacted before them by everyone who came before. The story told again in the landscape where it has always been told, the black silt moving slowly into every low place, and the grain already coming, already on its way, already made certain by the water that has never once failed to arrive. In the darkness below the world, where no light from the surface reaches, and no human eye has ever looked, Set stands at the prow of Ra's solar bark with a spear in his hand. This is where the narration finds him, not in the moment that has already been told, not in the hall with the decorated chest or the banks of the Nile, but here in the underworld, doing the work that falls to him every night without ceremony and without witness. The bark moves through the 12 hours of the dark, carrying the disk of the sun along its underground passage, and at the front of the boat, in the place where someone must stand, Set holds his spear raised against the serpent. Apep, the embodiment of dissolution, the force that would, if it were not stopped, swallow the light entirely and leave the morning unmade. This is the god who killed his brother. This is also the god whose vigilance ensures that the sun rises. These two facts sat together in the Egyptian religious imagination for centuries without apparent difficulty. The tradition did not resolve them, it held them both, regarding each one as true, as necessary, as part of the structure of a cosmos that was wide enough to contain them both without contradiction. To rest inside this story at its widest point is to find that it is not only a story about a murder or a feud or a throne, it is a story about the shape of the world, about the forces the ancient Egyptians identified as permanent, structural, and irreplaceable, even the ones that caused harm. Set's act against Osiris was condemned within the mythological tradition consistently and without ambiguity, and Set's labor at the prow of Ra's bark was also considered essential every night without exception. The tradition held both of these to be true simultaneously, and the interest of the myth at this distance lies in how it managed that. The Egyptian concept that organized all of this was matat, a word often translated as truth or justice or right order, but which in the Egyptian understanding was something closer to the structural principle of the cosmos itself, the way things were meant to be arranged when they were functioning as they should. Against Ma'at, the tradition placed Isfet, chaos, disorder, the force that works against coherent arrangement. These two principles were not understood as opposites that would eventually resolve into one another, with order winning and chaos permanently defeated. They were understood as permanent counterforces, each defining the other, each requiring the other's existence in order to remain meaningful. Set was the god most consistently associated with Isfet. His domain, the red desert beyond the reach of the Nile flood, the high wind, and the sandstorm, the territory that was by definition outside the fertile order that made Egyptian civilization possible, was the physical expression of this cosmic principle. And yet the tradition did not imagine that Isfeshem could or should be eliminated. What needed to happen, what Ma'at required, was that chaos be held in its proper place, acknowledged, contained, and made to serve the larger order rather than overturn it. This is why Seshem stood at the prow of the bark. In the darkness beneath the world, Apep the serpent waits each night in the subterranean river through which Rhea's boat must pass. Apep does not represent chaos in the way Set does, where Set is the desert wind, necessary and real. Apep is something older and more absolute, the primordial dissolution that preceded creation itself, and has never stopped seeking to reclaim what creation interrupted. Against this force, Set's specific capacity for disruption and violence became, every night, exactly what was needed. The chaos that threatened the cultivated world was answered in the underworld by a controlled and purposeful version of chaos, Set with his spear, doing what he was made to do. The ancient Egyptians who developed this theology were working with a cosmos that was not a moral tale moving toward resolution. It was a mechanism, intricate, balanced, requiring all of its components in order to function. What looks from one angle like a murderer standing watch over the sun looks from another angle like the only being in the cosmos with the specific qualities required to hold that position. Both angles are part of the tradition. Neither one cancels the other. The solar bark itself, as ancient Egyptian art depicts it, is a slim and elegant vessel, curved at both ends in the manner of actual boats used on the Nile. The disk of the sun rides in a shrine at its center, enclosed and protected, the light that the surface world depends on carried through the dark in this careful way, 1 hour at a time. Various gods are depicted aboard the bark depending on the source. Thoth, who governs knowledge and record. Horus, the sun whose claim to the throne mirrors the sun's claim to the sky. The mummified form of Osiris himself, sometimes shown at the center of the boat as a kind of passenger. The dead king whose restoration runs parallel to the sun's nightly passage and daily return. And at the prow, where the danger is greatest, where whatever threatens the bark will arrive first, Set, standing with his spear raised, watching the darkness ahead. The image is not one of triumph or spectacle. It is one of sustained, quiet labor. The battle against Apep was understood to be repeated every night without end. The serpent was not destroyed. It was repelled, driven back, made to release what it had tried to swallow, and the next night it would try again. This was the nature of the work Set performed. Not a single heroic deed, but a perpetual one. The same act committed again and again in the dark. The sun rising each morning as evidence that it had succeeded. The same battle beginning again as soon as the day ended. There is something in this image, the continuous, unwitnessed labor of a god whose reputation on the surface of the world was defined by one terrible act, that the tradition seems to have carried without distress. The ancient Egyptians apparently did not find it paradoxical. The god who murdered Osiris and the god who protects the sun each night were the same god, and both of these facts were accommodated inside a theology that was more interested in function than in moral consistency, as the modern imagination tends to construct it. The death of Osiris was, within this same tradition, the event that made the Egyptian afterlife conceptually possible. This is the turn in the story that requires the widest frame to hold. Osiris, before his death, was the king of the living world, the civilizer, the ruler of the fertile land, the embodiment of Mat in his own person, the figure who had received the throne from his father Geb and filled it as completely as any figure in the tradition was capable of filling anything. What he was not, before he died, was the king of the dead. That role did not exist in any fully realized form before the tradition needed it to exist. The death of Osiris was, in this sense, the event that created the need. Isis gathered what had been scattered. Through her magic, which the tradition consistently identified as the most powerful in the cosmos, more comprehensive than any other gods, she worked the act of reassembly and temporary restoration long enough for something essential to be preserved. From this, Horus was conceived, the child who would eventually take the throne of the living world, the son whose existence as avenger and heir gave the cycle of royal succession its mythological template, and Osiris descended into the underworld, where he became its presiding figure, the judge, the lord of the dead, the god before whom every human soul was eventually brought. The Hall of Two Truths, as the Book of the Dead papyri depict it, is one of the most precisely described spaces in Egyptian religious imagination. It is a long room, formal and ordered, lit in the manner of the funerary paintings that contain it, clear lines, careful color, everything in its assigned position. At one end, the deceased stands. At the center, a scale holds two pans. In one, the heart of the deceased. In the other, the feather of Ma'at, the physical symbol of the cosmic principle that structured everything. Anubis attends the scale, monitoring the balance with the careful attention of a god who has been performing this function for as long as the dead have been arriving. Thoth stands nearby with his palette and reed, ready to record the result. At the edge of the scene, a composite creature waits, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, the one assigned to consume the hearts that do not pass the weighing. The whole chamber has the quality of a judicial proceeding conducted with absolute seriousness, without theater, without sentiment. This was the afterlife that Osiris's death made possible. The logic runs as follows. For the dead to be received, judged, and welcomed into the existence that followed judgment, there needed to be a presiding authority, a god whose jurisdiction covered the realm of the dead, with the same comprehensiveness that Osiris's living kingship had covered the realm of the living. The transition from living king to lord of the dead was not a demotion in the Egyptian understanding. It was a transformation into something with wider jurisdiction. Every human being who died came eventually into Osiris's hall. Every human heart was eventually weighed. The scope of his authority after death exceeded anything a living king could claim, and this, in the theological reading that certain strands of Egyptian thought preserved, was not entirely separable from the act that caused his death. Osiris could not become Lord of the Dead without first dying. Someone had to be the agent of that death. The tradition condemned Set's act without ambiguity. The murder of Osiris is not presented in any Egyptian source as a justifiable or praiseworthy deed, and yet some threads of Egyptian theological thought, sitting alongside that condemnation rather than replacing it, held that the act was also necessary in a structural sense that no individual agent could be held entirely responsible for. The cosmos required a lord of the dead. The cosmos required Osiris to die. These were not comfortable thoughts, and the tradition did not present them as resolving the condemnation. It simply held them in proximity to each other, as it held many things in proximity, letting the complexity stand. The fields of Aru, where the justified dead were received after the weighing of the heart, were described in the funerary texts with a specificity that suggests the ancient Egyptians thought carefully about what a livable afterlife would contain. The landscape is one of tall grain and wide channels of water, open sky overhead, the dead working in the fields in a form of the agricultural life they had known on earth. Boats move along the waterways. The wheat grows as it grew on earth. The sun moves across the sky above the fields of Aru as it moves across the sky above Egypt, because in the Egyptian cosmological understanding, the solar bark passes through the underworld each night and rises again above the living world and the dead world both. What Set defends each night in the darkness below is the light that rises above the fields of Aru in the morning. The god who killed Osiris is, each night, also maintaining the illumination of the place Osiris presides over. This particular interweaving of functions, the way the tradition assigned roles to its figures that overlapped, contradicted, and depended on one another across every boundary, is one of the characteristic features of Egyptian theological thought that makes it interesting at this kind of calm, unhurried distance. It was not a simple system. It was not meant to be. The priests and theologians who maintained these traditions across centuries were working with a cosmos they understood as genuinely complex, genuinely multiple, full of forces that could not be reduced to a single allegiance or a single function without losing something essential about what those forces were. Set himself is an example of this multiplicity carried to its fullest expression. The tradition held him simultaneously as murderer and defender, as the god of a domain that was real and ancient and necessary, and as the figure whose specific act of violence against his brother was the founding event of the entire afterlife theology. Both of these held together, without resolution. There is a stone in the British Museum that preserves one of the most interesting records of Egyptian theological thought as it was practiced in a specific historical moment. The Shabaka stone, a flat slab of black basalt, its surface covered in dense columns of hieroglyphs incised into the stone, was commissioned by a pharaoh of the 25th dynasty as a copy of what he believed to be a much older document. The text it preserves is known as the Memphite Theology, a theological treatise that describes creation as proceeding through divine speech, through the word of the god Pa, who conceived the world in his heart and then spoke it into being. It is a sophisticated document, formally theological in its structure, attempting to articulate how the cosmos came to exist and how the gods relate to one another within it. The stone sits now in a museum case in London. People walk past it. The hieroglyphs are still legible to those who read them. The theological system it encodes, developed somewhere in the long span of Egyptian civilization, copied onto stone by a 25th dynasty pharaoh who wanted to preserve it, carried through the subsequent centuries by a series of transmissions, too various and contingent to fully trace, is still, in a sense, available. The thought is still there. The stone is still there. The inquiry that produced it is still legible for those who spend time with it. The Shabaka stone does not resolve the question of Set. No document in the Egyptian tradition resolves the question of Set. What the tradition offers instead is a series of positions, some in tension with one another, some complementary, some so distant from one another in origin and period that they may never have been intended to coexist. That, taken together, suggest a religious tradition that was comfortable holding complexity without being required to reduce it. Set's cult, across the long span of Egyptian history, passed through changes that altered how he was understood by each successive generation. The pre-dynastic veneration at Embos, one of the oldest cult centers in Egypt, predated any of the narratives that later defined him, predated the Osirian myth cycle, predated the written sources that would eventually frame him as the murderer, predated the consolidation of the Ennead as a formal theological structure. In those early centuries, he was simply a god of immense local power, worshipped at a bend in the Nile, in the territory that would always be most closely associated with him, long before anyone had occasion to define him against anything else. The pharaohs of the 19th dynasty carried his name in theirs: Seti I, Seti II, the royal cartouche inscribed with the Set animal hieroglyph as an element of royal identity, the dangerous god made part of the institution of kingship without apology or qualification. The temple of Seti I at Abydos, of all places, Abydos, the cult center of Osiris, the site most deeply identified with the murdered god, contains images of its builder in the formal posture of offering, his name legibly incorporating the name of the god who killed the deity, being honored in this very temple. This was not considered contradictory by the people who built it. The theology was wide enough to contain the king, who named himself for Set, standing in the house of Osiris, performing the rituals appropriate to the place. The Hyksos period complicated everything. The second intermediate period, when rulers from outside Egypt occupied the Nile Delta and established their capital at Avaris, brought with it an identification between the Hyksos and Set that the tradition found difficult to absorb without consequence. The Hyksos rulers adopted Set as their patron deity, perhaps because his domain included the foreign and the outside, perhaps for reasons that the surviving record does not make entirely clear. When Pharaoh Amos expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt, the association between Set and foreign occupation had been forged in a way that proved difficult to undo. The gradual demonization of Set, the long transformation from complex cosmic power to something more straightforwardly negative, unfolded across the centuries that followed. It was not sudden, and it was not complete for a very long time. Traces of the older, more complex Set persist in texts from periods well after the Hyksos expulsion. evidence that the tradition's capacity for complexity was not erased overnight, but the trajectory was established. The god who had been simultaneously murderer and defender of the sun, the god whose name was worn honorifically by pharaohs, the god whose cult at Ombos predated the first dynasties. This god began a long, slow movement toward the margins of the tradition, and eventually beyond them. In later Coptic and Gnostic contexts, the figure associated with Set had moved so far from his origin that the distance itself is a kind of historical fact worth holding quietly. What had been a cosmic force, necessary, ancient, assigned to a domain that the Egyptian world could not function without, had been reshaped across more than 1,000 years of religious transformation into something more like the figure of a deceiver, an adversary defined primarily by opposition to the good. The full complexity of the earlier tradition had been simplified. The desert wind had become something more like an accusation. This transformation is itself a record of how much the world around these stories changed. The Egypt that first told the story of Set and Osiris in the forms the pyramid texts preserve was a world that understood its gods as functionally plural, as beings whose roles could overlap and contradict without requiring resolution. The Egypt that slowly simplified, set into something less complicated, was a world increasingly in contact with other theological systems, other ways of organizing the divine, other frameworks for what a god was supposed to be and do. The story that survived into those later contexts was a reduced version of something that had been richer, that is not a complaint about the later tradition. It is simply what happens to stories across long time. The pyramid texts of Unas, inscribed in the burial chamber at Saqqara around 2375 BCE, reference the events involving Set and Osiris as though they are already settled, already ancient, already the common inheritance of everyone who would read them. The oldest written evidence for the myth does not introduce it, it assumes it. This means that by the time anyone thought to write the story down in its oldest surviving form, the story was already old enough that writing it down felt like preservation rather than creation. The tradition the pyramid texts encode was already the tradition by then. What preceded them, the oral transmission, the ritual enactment, the theological elaboration that produced the form the texts preserve, is mostly beyond recovery. What remains is the written record, and behind the written record, the suggestion of a longer silence in which the same stories were being told by means that left no inscription. The Passion plays at Abydos brought the same events into public enactment, year after year, generation after generation. Worshippers traveled to the site at the edge of the desert, where the boundary between the cultivated land and the red sand was visible from any point along the ceremony's path. The myth was enacted in public. The death of Osiris was mourned. The search of Isis was performed. The restoration was achieved. And then, in the following year, the cycle began again. The repetition was the point. The telling was not preparation for some future moment when the myth would be complete and could be set aside. The telling was itself the function, the reassertion, year after year, that the story was true and that its resolution was real, and that Osiris had indeed been restored, and that the dead were indeed received, and that the morning had indeed come after the night. In the annual inundation of the Nile, the flood that the ancient Egyptians understood as the return of Osiris, all of this came to its most concrete and physically verifiable expression. Each year, the dark, silt-laden water rose. It spread across the fields. The black land became black again, renewed by what the flood carried, made ready for another season of grain. The Egyptians called the inundation by a word that was also a name, Hapi, the god of the flood, the embodiment of the abundance the water brought. But they also understood the flood's annual return in relation to Osiris, to the fertility he embodied in his green-skinned agricultural aspect, to the renewal that his myth insisted was always possible after even the most absolute ending. The water that spread across the fields each inundation was doing what the Egyptian tradition said it had always done, following the pattern it had followed for as long as the Nile had existed, indifferent to the particular year in which it arrived, and entirely consistent in what it accomplished. The black silt settled over the red edges of the desert, extending the Kemet into the Deshret. Temporarily, the boundary that in ordinary months was so sharp that a person could stand with one foot on each side of it, clearly in one world, and then clearly in another. At inundation, that boundary softened. The water moved across it. The dark soil spread, and then the water receded. The boundary returned. The red land and the black land resumed their positions. The two territories that had always mapped onto the two brothers settled back into their usual relationship, distinct, adjacent, each defining the other across a line as old as the landscape itself. This is where the tradition rests, finally, not in the resolution of a conflict, because the conflict was never resolved within the Egyptian mythological framework. Set did not cease to be what he was. Osiris did not return to the living world. Horus took the throne his father had held, and the living king was understood as Horus, and the dead king was understood as Osiris, and the cycle of succession was given its mythological architecture, and that architecture held for as long as the pharaonic tradition held, which was a very long time. But Set remained. The desert remained. The desert remained. The red land remained exactly where it had always been, holding its position at the edge of the black land, doing what it had always done. Ra's bark descends again into the underworld as the night falls, as it has always descended. The 12 hours of darkness gather around it. In the painted depictions on the walls of New Kingdom tombs, the bark's passage is shown in careful sequence, each hour of the underworld with its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own obstacles, the progression through darkness that ends, when the work has been done, in the eastern horizon, and the return of light. Set stands at the prow in the darkness, as he stands there every night, spear raised, doing the work that the tradition assigned to him long before anyone wrote it down. The sun rises over the fields of Aru, where the dead are working. It rises over the Nile, where the water is moving northward toward the delta, carrying whatever the river always carries. It rises over the boundary between the black land and the red land, illuminating both equally, the line between them as sharp and clear in the morning light as it has ever been. The grain that will follow the flood is still weeks away. The fields are dark with settled silt. The sky above them is the color that appears in Egyptian painting behind every divine scene, a particular blue, not the blue of the deep sky at noon, but the quieter blue of morning, the blue that is still holding a little of the night. Osiris receives the dead in his hall, as the tradition says he always has. Anubis weighs the hearts with careful attention. Thoth records the results.